appreciate you all taking the time to learn about this topic today. First of all, though, I want to thank the presenters who you will meet soon, and they each bring a unique perspective as well as a commitment to achieving a just and lasting peace in Israel and Palestine. I also want to thank the Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco for hosting this webinar. It's part of their monthly series of forums on a wide range of topics that are current and important. And I've attended a number of their previous forums, and I highly recommend them. You'll get some information on that in some information that we'll follow up with after the webinar. And really, most importantly, I want to thank all of you who are here. I salute you for giving up your Sunday afternoon in order to learn and explore this topic with us. Now, we know that this topic can be really sensitive for some people, and it can evoke strong emotions. And we applaud everyone who's here, and we expect that everyone has come with an open mind and an open heart. It's our sincerest wish that everyone here learn something today. And remember that learning requires being open to new ideas. We want to make the best use of our time here and to be efficient in how we run this webinar. So we've established some ground rules for our time together today. First of all, please keep yourself muted during the presentations. And we recommend that you set the Zoom to speaker mode. And if you need any help doing that, you could send me a private message and I can explain that. Please, if you have any questions, post them in the chat. We have two people monitoring the chat. One of them is Jennifer Beach, who has conveniently named herself Questions and Answers. She will be collecting questions that are posed during the presentations, and they will be addressed during the Q&A period at the end. We also have another monitor, Ellen Brodsky, who will be responsible for maintaining respectful behavior. And anyone who is exhibiting disrespectful comments or actions will be removed from the Zoom. The webinar is being recorded, and information on how to get the recording will be sent out to everybody who is registered in the following follow-up email that will include resources that we've discussed today and ways for you to take action. Now, this webinar covers quite a bit of religious theory as it relates to Zionism, to Israel, and to Palestine, or the Holy Land. We have people here now who are leaders of faith communities. We also have lay people of faith. But we recognize that we also have people of little faith, people who question faith, and people of no faith at all. And really, that's all good. I think we all share a faith in the power of people to pursue justice in the world. That's why we're here. So with that thought of pursuing justice, I'd like to invite Corey Weinstein, who is a member of my synagogue, or Shalom Jewish Community, to offer an interfaith prayer that he's written. And for those who might be uncomfortable with prayer, please just understand that this is offered in the spirit of setting us off with a positive intention to seek justice. Corey?
Thank you very much, Elliot. It's quite an honor to present here. I wrote this prayer after reading that while there are 12 major religions, mine by numbers, mine not among them, there are actually presently more than 4,000 religious beliefs that have been cataloged in the world today. So that's a result. This is a result of that knowledge. We pray. Let us be glad we are able to gather together and be thankful for the work of those who brought us here. Let us be hopeful that we have the courage and the strength to navigate this dangerous moment of the pandemic and the racist and anti-Semitic assault on our troubled democracy. We know that the ineffable source of all is revealed to us like light shining through a 1,000-faceted diamond. The 1,000 prisms shine the infinite light of essential truth to be appreciated in different ways by each loving tradition. I pray that we study, work, and worship together with joy and gratitude for our own ways and for others' ways, and that we find strength and meaning in our diversity. Amen.
Thank you, Corey. All right, well, let's get started. The first thing we want to address is, of course, what is Christian Zionism? And to open us up, we'll have a couple of our clergy here to speak on that. First is Reverend John Anderson, retired Presbyterian minister, and he's also co-moderator of the Presbyterian Israeli-Palestine Mission Network. John?
John, you need to unmute yourself.
Unmute. Thank you, Elliot, for your leadership, for gathering us together. Thank you, Corey, for that prayer that reminds us of the unity of who we are and where we're all going towards justice. That's really great. And greetings to all of you, and thank you for inviting me to share. I have to say that I'll be sharing some things that many of you know more about than I. And you'll say, what about this? And you forgot that. And that will all be true as well. After decades of being enmeshed in the Christian Zionist culture, it's challenging to look at it from the inside out, to see myself and my community clearly. During the inauguration, Jennifer Lopez sang, "This land is your land. This land is my land. This land was made for you and me." It may have been an emotional moment for us. We were all equal together, claiming common land, celebrating that. But really, the attitude expressed in the song normalizes our ownership, manipulation, and personal power. This was a land we assert without a people, God-given to become ours, to settle and possess. In fact, you and I reside on stolen land, and none of our so-called possessions belong to us. The doctrine of discovery, declared by Pope Alexander VI on May 4th, 1493, stated that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited by Christian rulers. Possession, manipulation, and power. We know it as colonialism. If colonizers couldn't be victors in every corner of this uncivilized world, they would, they thought, inescapably become victims in those barbaric lands. In the U.S. Supreme Court case Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823, Chief Justice John Marshall's opinion in the unanimous decision held that the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to New World lands. In essence, native peoples as temporary residents could be eliminated. Colonialism takes the land and exploits it for economic benefit, but keeps the indigenous population for slave or cheap labor. And as needed, they remove opposition, crush rebellions, torture, and imprison. Settler colonialism conquers by forcing the indigenous people off the land through economic exploitation, starvation, and violence. Settler colonialists intend to establish a nation state by cleansing it of native people. Settler colonialists exploit the land, its resources, and endanger the planet. The birth of Christian Zionism can be traced to the emergence of dispensationalist theology. Many of you have never heard that. You're okay. In the mid-19th century, The theology of John Nelson Darby provided unique views on eschatology, or the future of the world, and ecclesiology, the role of the church in that future, which became widely used in the U.S. This theology was used to reorganize the biblical text and provide the Zionist with fertile ground. This theology was constructed around 7 major epochs, which progressively unfold, leading to the embracing of Zionism by the church and the establishment of Israel, all constructed as the needed precondition to bring forth the second coming of Jesus. Zionist colonialism is clothed in the vision of taking land to facilitate the return of God in the flesh and the ushering in of a 1,000-year reign of peace with Christ in Christian Zionism. 2 days after the Ottoman surrender of Jerusalem, British General Allenby entered the city on foot, declaring on an historic occasion, "The wars of the Crusades are now complete," he said. The Balfour Declaration of November 2, 1917, fulfilled the goals for the British and Zionists and was incorporated into the treaties ending World War I. Colonizing Palestine begins as a Western vision with international approval, dispossessing the Palestinians and granting their land and country to the Zionists, a modern reenactment of ancient biblical narratives and preparation of the ground for the second coming. Ben-Gurion, founder of the State of Israel, in 1937 said, "A Jewish state on only part of the land is not the end, but the beginning. We shall organize an advanced defense force. I am confident that we would not fail in settling in the remaining parts of the country through agreement and understanding with our Arab neighbors or through some other means." 10 years later, over 500 Palestinian villages were depopulated, and more than 850,000 Palestinian women, men, and children were massacred or forced from their land, homes, and history. Political support for Zionist conquest and colonization of the Holy Land and its geography, rooted in Christian Zionism theology, consistently urges for the unconditional support for Israel, no matter what international law it breaks, pressing Congress and the White House to maintain Israel as a close and uncontested ally. President Biden says, "I am a Zionist. If there were no Israel, we would need to invent one." In the mid-1950s, evangelist Reverend Jerry Falwell preached against racial integration, saying it will destroy our race eventually. After integration arrived, he founded the Lynchburg Christian Academy for Whites. Falwell and the moral majority made support for Israel one of the organization's top priorities. Falwell said, "Whenever the U.S. gets too critical of Israel, God will bring down judgment on the U.S." When Israel bombed Iraq in 1983, Prime Minister Begin called Falwell before notifying President Reagan, asking Falwell to interpret the act to the American people. Christian Zionist theology no longer influences mainline Christian churches in the U.S. and Europe. However, it is still found in evangelical circles and in Latin America and Africa. September 11th, 2001, and the wars in Iraq and Syria inspired the reemergence of a rapture and millennialist megachurches movement that work to explain geographical and geopolitical events through biblical eyes that centered on Christian Zionism, Israel, and Islamophobia. And just to sum up, Christian Zionists support the political goals and ideology of Jewish political Zionism with biblical justification. They give their blessing to Israel to achieve their goals. They use distorted and erroneous theology to express concern for Jews, which ultimately leads to the death and genocide of most Jews and the conversion of the rest to Christianity, while Muslims are to be eliminated. This genocide is the manifestation of the doctrine of discovery. Christian Zionism's focus is on power and domination, using the backdrop of the expected second coming as the vehicle to achieve it. It seeks legitimacy in defending a false truth and not the reality of justice or a just world. Christian Zionists claim that their own persecution and God's liberating hope through political means is what it's all about. For them, theological empire is acceptable, even as it deprives rights and equality from others, and lifts one faith and race above all others. It sees itself at the same time as victim and victor, persecuted and persecutor, in a culture where power and the fear of losing it is everything. Justice is not part of the equation. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I think that closing that power and justice are really not a part of the big picture, and I think really neither is God. We really appreciate that background. Next, I want to present Reverend Sadie Stone. Sadie's the pastor of Bethany United Methodist Church in San Francisco, and she's also active in Surge, Showing Up for Racial Justice, San Francisco chapter. Thanks for being here, Sadie.
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. So I want to pick up from a little bit where my colleague, Reverend John, left off. So we heard a little bit about the background of what Christian Zionism is. And maybe some of you who aren't Christian or aren't Christian Zionists think, like, what does that have to do with me? Well, Christian Zionism espouses this idea, as Reverend John said, that there's this divine will of God for this ingathering of Jews to populate and claim the whole land of Palestine as a prophetic prelude to the end times. And so it's a colonizing idea. Christian Zionists, while they are not the colonizers themselves, those who ascribe to this theology provide financial and political support for the annexation of Palestinian land with a zealous religious fervor, which means that this shows up in our policy, in our foreign policies over and over and over again. Christian Zionists have a huge impact on the policies that exist in the United States. In the process, the indigenous Palestinians are racially demonized as terrorists and stripped of their humanity, land, and human rights. So we're going to look a little bit about what this looks like in politics. We can look back as recently as last June, when the Christians United for Israel, the largest pro-Israel organization, hosted a summit that included both Israeli and U.S. public officials. This included people like U.S. Secretary of State at the time, Mike Pompeo, Senators Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and Tom Cotton. Christians United for Israel is a powerful and dangerous organization that has over 7 million members, large, vast pools of money that lobbies politicians and other religious groups to support Israel. They do things like claim credit for influencing Trump to transfer the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Now, why is that move, this move of the U.S. embassy, a politically important move? Well, Israel's parliament and the prime minister's home are currently in Jerusalem, but they sit in West Jerusalem, on the side of the city that Israel has controlled since 1949. In 1967, Israel captured East Jerusalem and annexed that half of the city. The international community, by and large, considers East Jerusalem to be an occupied territory. And that half of the city contains sites holy to all three major monotheistic religions, including the Western Wall, the holiest place in the world where Jews can openly pray, and also the Haram al-Sharif, Arabic for the noble sanctuary, which is a sacred site for Muslims that Israelis refer to as the Temple Mount. So Palestinians, their desire is to divide the city and make East Jerusalem the capital of future Palestine state, whereas the Israelis disagree and want to maintain control over the entire city of Jerusalem. All of this helps explain why the Israeli government was pleased when Trump made good on his campaign promise to move and recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and also move our U.S. embassy there. Now, I want to make something clear that Trump isn't the first U.S. president to talk about moving the U.S. embassy. Bill Clinton said he supported the idea in principle. George W. Bush declared that he would move the U.S. ambassador there in 2000. President Barack Obama, on his part, referred to the city as the capital of Israel and said it must remain undivided. And over again, Congress has repeatedly passed legislation calling for the embassy to move. However, none of the previous presidents followed through. And one reason for that is because this move would put the U.S. squarely on the side of Israel. It was a very political move to move our embassy into Jerusalem. And the Christian Zionists take credit for having their influence in having that happen. Additionally, this same organization had access to the East Room when Trump was in there talking about his plans for peace in the Middle East. So they are part of these decision makings and policy things that are happening in our government. Additionally, and even more problematic, is that there is this idea of that the eradication of Palestine is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So they believe that God is on their side, and that it's further dangerous because there's an understanding that America plays a God-ordained role in this. So not only does Christian Zionism believe this in their religion, but they believe that our nation, America, is God-ordained to play some sort of role in bringing this about. So John Hagee welcomes the use of military power to carry out this mission that he believes is God's will, to the point that Trump's own Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, said that Trump was raised up by God to defend Israel. It's all over our politics. This also looks like military aid to Israel, which was included in as recently as the December 21st COVID-19 relief package. Now you might be thinking that's a COVID-19 relief package for us here in the United States. What does Israel have to do with it? It's a very good question. However, within that relief package, just a few weeks ago, there were $3.3 billion in security assistance sent to Israel and $500 million for U.S.-Israeli missile defense cooperation. And lest we think support for Israel is just a Republican agenda, because I want to make this very clear, this is not something that happened with Trump. This is not just a Trump thing. It's been a long bipartisan priority, and for decades, the U.S. has steadily provided military aid and assistance. Some of the other work that I do is looking at the role of the U.S. government in military aid to the Philippines, and one of our frequent chants is from Palestine to the Philippines, stop the U.S. war machine. There's a well-known and well-funded way in which the United States is directly contributing to human rights violations in not only in Israel, but in other places across the globe. And questioning the use of those funds, how are those funds being used in Israel, is something that's largely not done. Whether the aid is being used to sustain the illegal occupation of Palestine and finance Jewish settlements and violate human rights, that's considered to be a taboo topic, something that's not investigated or brought up. Bernie Sanders is one of the only members of Congress to question the aid, and Joe Biden in response is quoted as saying, "The idea that I'd withdraw military aid as others has suggested from Israel is bizarre." So again, I want to reiterate, this is not a Trump problem. This is a bipartisan problem. There's widespread support funded and lobbied by Christian Zionists. Additionally, Israel has been the world's leading recipient of U.S. aid since World War II. According to the U.S. Congressional Research Service, Israel has received $146 billion of U.S. taxpayers' money as of November 2020. So $146 billion has been sent over to Israel. And as of February 2019, the U.S. has decided to withhold all funds to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. So they cut aid to the UN Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian Refugees, the last lifeline that provides education and health services to millions of displaced people. So they cut off aid to help refugees and are funding the military forces that are perpetuating that displacement. In large part, U.S. aid to Israel has also covered losses that are generated by boycott and divestment tactics, which I hope many of you know about. It's not the topic of this particular webinar, but it is a tactic that's being used. However, U.S. aid is able to compensate for those boycott and divestment tactics and bring the expense of keeping 3.7 million Palestinians under brutal military closure is something that the U.S. is helping Israel do. As Representative Ilhan Omar noted, Congress support for Israel has been stronger than voter support because the strength of the lobby groups. These Christian Zionist groups are well funded, and there are lots of them. So ultimately, the treatment of the Palestinian rests with the state of Israel and the Israel Defense Forces as the occupying power. The support of Christian Zionism should be a concern for all of us, especially those of us in the United States, because it's a major contributor to the oppression which directly impacts both Muslim and Christian Palestinians and leads to their incarceration and death. And of course, this is directly linked to white supremacy. So I want to make sure that this linkage is also very clear. These are forces that are working together. At the insurrection on the Capitol on June 6th, Christian messages were espoused. Banners with the name of Jesus, a prayer of white nationalism was spoken from the floor of Congress, and then flags of Israel were also being flown. If you look at pictures, there they are, next to the Trump flags, the flags of the United States, the Blue Lives Matter flags, and flags of Israel. White supremacists have connected these two movements together. And so I want to read to you this quote by Tariq, who wrote an article for Fosna that illustrates the connection in this way. He says, Trump proposed the deportation of 4 U.S. congresswomen who dare to speak against white nationalism, and he placed Israel at the center of his reasoning, saying Israel feels abandoned because those 4 have challenged concentration camps, the outsized influence of lobby dollars, and Trump's vision of a white plurality. That is telling for Trump that Israel is a model. It's a model of a state whose borders are closed to people of a particular race and political belief, a state that bends to the world to its military and economic gravity, a state that projects superiority, and a hub for technical and capital. Challenging Israel is essential to challenging white nationalism because, as Trump has made clear in recent weeks, the two are working hand in hand. White supremacy and Zionism are two of a kind, which both model an ethnic exclusion. Therefore, if one opposes exclusion and the desire for a racially or religiously pure nation, one must also oppose Zionism. And I want to make this clear that this is not to suggest that fascists and neo-Nazis and white supremacists like Jewish people. There is no misinterpreting or minimizing the hateful anti-Semitism of the blood-curdling chants like Jews will not replace us. These racists tend to dislike anyone and everyone who is not from their community, and this includes the Jewish people. So this shows you the way in which Zionism and being Jewish are not the same thing. And so indeed racist, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So white supremacists in particular are not only anti-Semitic, but they're also obviously anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-Latina, Islamophobic, homophobic, misogynistic, as we all know. But there's a sense that Israel is being used as a test case of this final dominion and control, using bad theology of Christian Zionism to create a world where Palestinian people are imprisoned, displaced, and killed. And it's ultimately anti-Semitic in nature, because its true completion of vision for Christian Zionists is when a Christ figure returns and there's a rapture forcing conversion or leaving behind those who won't convert. So I want to make that very clear that these two movements are working hand in hand right now. I just finally want to sum up my part by saying that there are things that we must do to combat this. I obviously come at this from a faith perspective. I'm a pastor, and so Christian Zionism and people perpetuating this movement in the name of my faith is incredibly troubling to me. And so for those of us who are Christians, part of our responsibility is to understand what Christian Zionism is, where it's rooted from, how it's using bad theology to control and manipulate people. And then it's a responsibility of all of us to understand how it's being used in our policies, in our government. As I just illustrated in just a few examples, our government is highly connected to Israel, and it's directly tied back to Christian Zionist forces. So we have a responsibility, one, of education, and then to make sure that we're talking with our representatives. We're using a broad range. We need more and more people to actively be against this, to have an understanding of what Christian Zionism is and Zionism in general, so that we have an ability to counteract those, and we can stop putting all of our military spending and contributing to human rights violations around the globe. We need to be more aware of how our money is being used. So those are just some ways that we can combat this, but I'm going to stop here and turn it over to the next speakers.
Thank you, Sadie. I'm kind of out of breath, but thank you so much. Sadie mentioned something about bad theology. Reverend Dr. William Barber with the Poor People's Campaign calls it theological malpractice. I think that's a good way of looking at it. And just like, Sadie said, coming at it from a Christian point of view, it's, she feels there's this compulsion to stand up against this misuse of Christian theology. And I think a lot of Jewish people, and I think there have been some comments in the chat, we feel similarly that Zionism is not, it should not be equated with Judaism or being Jewish. Sadie also said earlier that this is not a Trump problem. And there's an organization called Eyewitness Palestine, and they do tours of Palestine, and they're doing them virtually now. And on Christmas Day, I did an Eyewitness Palestine tour of Bethlehem. What better thing for a Jewish guy to do on Christmas than to visit Palestine? And one of the people on the tour asked the tour guide, I said something like, I know Trump has been a nightmare for Palestinians. And the tour guide just laughed. He said, every US president has been a nightmare for Palestinians. And I think it's important for us to keep in mind that all of this talk about the politics and power, really, it affects real people living real lives in Palestine and in the diaspora. So the next person I'd like to ask to speak is Tamaris Muganam. She's a Palestinian Christian. She is active with NorCal Sabeel and with the North Coast Coalition for Palestine. Tamaris?
Okay. What an honor to be on this Zoom with the other distinguished presenters. Especially, I just want to say this, Rabbi Alyssa, I so appreciate your work with JVP on Palestine. Both my husband and I are supporters, so I thank you. And thank you, Elliot, for inviting me to speak, for your courage to pursue this challenging subject, and for bringing us together, however virtually. There's lots to share with you, so I wrote it all down. I'm not an expert on this topic, but I've agreed to share some personal thoughts from a unique perspective I hold. I am Palestinian by birth, and I'm Christian. And as happens to so many Christian Palestinians, I too have been asked a few times, when did you convert? I always smile and say, 2,000 years ago. And where do you think Christianity began? And by the way, Jesus is my cousin. That usually gets a quiet response. Many people assume that all Palestinians are Muslim. I don't have a problem with people thinking I'm Muslim, except that I'm not. I am a descendant of the first Palestinian Christian community from the time of Jesus, who was also Palestinian and, of course, Jewish. And my ancestors have lived in Palestine through all the upheavals of all the centuries until 1948. I'm older than the state of Israel. My birth certificate says that I was born in Jerusalem in 1947, a few months before Palestine was divided by the United Nations, and over half of it was given to the new Jewish state. I won't go into that tragic history, tragic from a Palestinian perspective, except to say, as has been mentioned, that 750,000 Palestinians, over half the population at the time, were displaced, emptied out of the part of Palestine given to the Jews. Now, many Palestinians were driven out of their homes at the point of a gun, and their villages were systematically destroyed so they couldn't return. And many others, shocked and traumatized, fled the violence and horror. That's what happened to my family. All this, as many of you probably know, is documented even by Israeli historians like Ilan Pappé, and can be easily found if you are interested. The Palestinians, who were the majority of the population at the time, were never really consulted or negotiated with before Palestine was divided. The partition was imposed on them. And of course they rebelled. Who wouldn't? There was a lot of fighting and massacres committed by Israeli terrorist organizations that came very close to where we lived. And one early May Day in 1948, my dad came home from work and told my mother to get the kids ready because we had to get away immediately. And so we fled across the Jordan River to the country of Jordan, thinking we would be back when things settled down. Of course, things never did. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees, most of whom ended up in refugee camps, were never allowed to return to their homes in Palestine, contrary to UN resolutions requiring that they be allowed to return. They're still in those refugee camps, many of them, now in the millions in neighboring Arab countries. I was not yet a year old when we fled Palestine, the youngest of 5 children, and for the next 10 years of my life we lived in Jordan as poor refugees. There are plenty of refugees in our world today, unfortunately, so you have an idea, I hope, of the terrible hardships refugees go through. But providentially, my dad, who was a teacher, soon found a teaching job in Jordan, and there we lived, a very simple and struggling life until we came to America, the land of milk and honey. I was 10.5 years old when we left Jordan. That's another painful story of displacement, which I won't go into. I grew up in a religiously devout family. My father's name is Abraham, Ibrahim in Arabic, and truly a man of faith like his namesake. My uncles and aunts were named, I'll say it in Arabic, Yaqub, Ishaq, Miriam, Sarah, Nahum, Ilyas, to name only a few, and these are all biblical names. We didn't have storybooks when we were little, but my dad would gather us around him before bedtime and would tell us Bible stories from the Hebrew Bible. He was a great storyteller, and those stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and his brothers all made a deep impression on my young soul. I loved the Bible and studied it in school, even as a college student and after. I identified with the Hebrew struggle. But it didn't occur to me until many years later that the God of the Old Testament seemed to prefer one people over another and would give one people's land to another. I tried to make sense of it, but couldn't. How could I believe in a God who would approve of brutal injustice happening to me and my family and so many other innocent people? I read Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel for a class on the prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, Micah and all the rest of them. And there I saw a different face of the Hebrew God, which felt right to me. The God of the prophets seemed not to be so tribal-minded and exclusive. I then understood that this Hebrew tribal God who could prefer one people over another and set one tribe against another is not really who God is, but is the expression of a Hebrew tribal people writing their own myths in the deepest sense of that word and in search of their own identity. As a young adult on a spiritual quest, when pondering Jesus' words and actions as well as the Hebrew prophets, I felt confirmed in my new perception of God. The God of Jesus, who I came to understand and follow, is an all-inclusive God who insists on the divine presence in everyone and everything. This God does not have favorites, but loves and cares about every human being, no exception, and all creation. As a Christian Palestinian, I am obviously affected deeply by the Zionist ideology. But first, as a human being, I'm aware, as Rabbi Michael Lerner somewhere said, that what happened in 1948 is an utter tragedy, like people jumping out of the windows of a burning building onto the heads of people below. I'm aware of the centuries of suffering the Jewish people endured, culminating in the horrible Holocaust. However, centuries of Jewish suffering does not justify the suffering of what the Palestinians, under a brutal Israeli government and military, have had to endure for longer than I have been alive. Is one people's suffering of more value than another's? The unlearned lessons of history, the cycle of suffering and oppression of one people over another. This is always what happens when the wounds of the people are not healed. Zionism, as I understand it and as I see it playing out, has come to mean Jewish supremacy and entitlement over all of historical Palestine. This is a fact. It's a fact on the ground, not just my opinion. If you've read any of the archival sources about Zionism, even from its early founders, this was the hidden plan. In Palestinian East Jerusalem today, for example, home by ancient home is being emptied out of its Palestinian inhabitants by militant Jewish settlers, intent on carrying out the Zionist goal of a self-proclaimed nation state for Jews only. That's what ethnic cleansing is. God gave this land to us, they claim, but 65% of Israelis are atheists or non-religious. But they still insist that God gave the land to them. God gave the land to them. It really is about land. I believe there's enough land there for everybody, if only the Israelis and their supporters are willing to share historical Palestine with all its inhabitants equally. Most Palestinians I know would agree with me on that. I will say this for the benefit of those who do not know me. I'm not against the state of Israel. I'm not anti-Semitic. And as a Palestinian Arab, I am a Semite. What I am against is the injustice of ripping indigenous people away from their rightful homes and properties and arbitrarily putting others in their places. I'm against one group of people dominating another, creating different repressive laws for them, denying them their human rights and basic needs, like water and electricity, and I might add, vaccination against COVID. Don't ever believe that criticizing the policies of the State of Israel toward the Palestinians is anti-Semitic. Unfortunately, that is becoming the most effective way to shut down any disagreement with Israel's inhumane policies toward the Palestinians. Beit Salem, an Israeli human rights organization, has recently courageously pointed out the reality on the ground and called Israel an apartheid state and not the democracy it claims to be. A Jewish state for Jews only was and is the goal of Zionism, however you look at it. Personally, this also means that I can never return to live in my homeland if I so choose, because I'm Palestinian. Even if I'm an American citizen, which of course I am, and I pay my taxes, some of which go to Israel to help finance the occupation of the Palestinians. But any Jewish person anywhere in the world is welcome to go to Israel and become a citizen automatically, with all the benefits attached to that. What would you call that? About Christian Zionists, Reverend Sadie mentioned the Israeli flag being waved around by those people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. Is our own U.S. brand of white supremacists who want to make America white again, identifying with Israelis who want to make Israel pure and free of all non-Jews? More and more reports are coming out that many of those insurrectionists were Christian Zionists who were largely responsible for getting Trump into the White House. A New York Times article listed in the resources, which I believe you will soon be getting, clearly stated that Christian Zionists, with financial help from billionaires like Sheldon Adelson, who recently passed, were the push behind Trump allowing Israel to annex the Syrian Golan Heights, the move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, the building of more and more illegal settlements in the West Bank, the effort to shut down Students for Justice in Palestine groups on university campuses throughout the world and in the U.S., of course, and so much more. Ex-Vice President, I think it was mentioned, Pence and ex-U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo are avowed Christian Zionists who allowed their religious beliefs to contaminate U.S. policy, especially in relation to Israel and Iran, as the article states. As a follower of Jesus, I am appalled, really appalled, as we all should be, by the agenda of Christian Zionists. What they believe is diametrically opposed to the message of the Jesus they claim to follow by calling themselves Christian. And then I wonder, is it the terrible suffering in the world that they are trying to escape by longing for a second coming? We all want a better world, but we have to work for it, not just wish it to happen, and wait for a savior to come and take us away in a rapture. Christian Zionists pour hundreds of millions of dollars into Israel every year, as has been mentioned already, which facilitates the cleansing of Palestinians and other non-Jews from Israel and speeds up the territorial expansion of Israel into the West Bank. But to what end? This is where the strangest thinking comes in, but which seems to benefit both the Jewish Zionists and the Christian Zionists. They are using each other to their own ends. Strange bedfellows indeed. As we've heard, when the prophecy of the second coming is fulfilled, Jews will have to convert to Christianity. And those who don't, well, you know where they will end up. How pathetic is that? How heretical and how truly anti-Semitic. There are many accounts of Christian Zionist tourists and preachers in the holy places refusing to speak to their fellow Christian Palestinians when visiting the holy sites. They don't consider us Christian. Why? Because we're Palestinian. To relate to us would be a political act of recognition, which they refuse to make. My hope is that more people, like all of you and all of us, will understand and appreciate more deeply the problem of Christian Zionism in the US, as well as in Palestine, Israel. And that all of us together can push the new administration to open its eyes and ears to what is really happening there and what we are supporting, and therefore complicit in. The new Biden administration seems to be off to a good start, but not on this issue. It looks like we have a lot of work ahead of us if we are to convince his administration that they need to end the double standard in Palestine, Israel. Because what is happening there is really despicable and morally unacceptable, and it is hurtful for both Israelis as well as Palestinians. With our help, they have to decipher, the new administration, what is real on the ground today from what is built on fantasy, arbitrary selection and interpretation of Bible texts, and military might. Too many Palestinian lives have been unjustly disrupted and destroyed in my own lifetime, and that has to stop. Finally, my hope and my prayer is that we will see a path to peace, a real path to peace in the near future. A peace built on justice and equality for all living in that holy land. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamaris. Inshallah, may it be in our time and may it be soon. Really appreciate that. The next person I want to call to present, who maybe can shed some light on this complicated relationship between Judaism and Zionism, and possibly could also speak to what we can all do about it, which all of the previous speakers have mentioned. We're going to have Rabbi Elisa Wise speak. Elisa is the Deputy Director of Jewish Voice for Peace, and as Therese said previously, she's an inspiration to many of us. Elisa?
Hi, everybody. It's evening here where I am. I'm calling in from Philadelphia. Therese, I just want to thank you so much for that generous offering you made. I feel really grateful that you felt willing to share your personal story with us in that way. So I'm very excited about this conversation. And I'm really grateful and encouraged by the number of you here and how many are interested in having this conversation. And I just wanted to pause for a minute. I know it's been a lot of listening, but I also want to see who we kind of have here. Just if you have your cameras on, we could do it maybe by a show of hands. I want to know who I'm talking to. If you are part of a Christian community, can you just raise your hand, and we could scroll through and see where we are. Hi, Christian friends in this movement. Hello, Christian friends. Okay. If you are in the Jewish community, can you raise your hand? Hello, Jewish community friends. If you're in the Muslim community, raise your hand. I know I see Imam Siddiqui here, at least on my screen. I don't know who else is here from the Muslim community. Hi, I see a few other Muslim friends. Are there people of other faiths on the call? I mean, maybe you could put in the chat what faith traditions you're from, or if you're not part of a faith tradition, just what that is. Great. Okay. It's cool to know what a mix we have here in the call. And it takes a multi-faith. It's going to take a multi-faith approach. And I think throughout my time at JVP, I've been here 10 years now, the times that we have fought together side by side with faith partners, whether it be for divestment in the Presbyterian Church, for example, which I have done with some of you here on the call today. Hi, everybody. Or fighting Islamophobia with our friends in the Muslim community, fighting together, right, is actually what I think is really promising. So with that, I want to ask another question, also by a show of hands. How many of you have heard the phrase, a land without a people for a people without a land? Is this a phrase that people have heard before? Almost everybody. Okay. If you've heard this phrase before, is it your understanding that this is a phrase that came from the Jewish community? Who thinks like this is a Jewish Zionist statement, that you've heard it in Jewish Zionist context? Just by a show of hands. Okay, most of us. That's what I thought too. And it's not the case. I just learned this and I wanted to share it with all of you. I learned this recently, actually on the JVP's Diaspora podcast, that the phrase, a land without a people for a people without a land, was it originally a Christian Zionist formulation. It actually came from the Church of Scotland by a clergyman named Alexander Keith in the year 1843, which is a long time ago, right? And so I actually think, and the reason I bring this up and the reason I think this is really noteworthy for me, this history, which when I first learned that on the Diaspora podcast, I started researching it because I felt like my whole life I had understood that was like, I was taught that within the Jewish community, and I was taught that was like a Jewish Zionist concept and a rallying cry. And of course, Jews used it and embraced it. But I think it's really important as we enter this conversation about Christian Zionism to understand that from the beginning of the political Zionist project, right? There's lots of different forms of Zionism that have existed over time. Not lots, some, right? But what we live with now is a specific kind of Zionism, which is political Zionism, right? Like cultural Zionism of like Ahad Ha'am or other Martin Buber didn't win out, right? What won out was a form of political Zionism that I believe it's important for us to understand from the very beginning was a partnership between Christian Zionism and Jewish Zionism. And I think that understanding that this way is actually kind of transformative for what that means for how our work carries forward. So in 1843, Alexander Keith first used this phrase, and it is noted that he actually knew this is earlier we heard about and talked about the settler colonialism and the colonialist nature of Zionism. He actually understood, he traveled to 1839 to Palestine. So he actually knew that it was not a land without a people. And actually his son is believed to be the first photographer to come in from the West to take photos in Palestine. So he actually really understood and knew that it was not a land without a people. And interestingly, I, of course, wanted to understand, well, how did the Jewish community respond to this? And the first thing that I was able to find was actually many years later, in actually 1925, in Germany. There was a German Zionist weekly paper where the writer, the editor of it said, "We may be a people without a home, but alas, there is not a country without a people. Palestine has an existing population of 700,000. So it was just interesting to me also as we get to this question of like Judaism and Zionism, you know, it's a cliche and a joke to say that Jews don't agree on anything, but it's also very true. And there's always been disagreement within the Jewish community about the question of Zionism, and we know that. And so for today's conversation, you know, I think when I said at the beginning, I'm really excited this conversation is happening, is because I do feel that there's an urgency to talking more about Christian Zionism as we do our work towards Palestinian freedom and ending Israeli apartheid. And as we also discussed earlier was Balfour, right? So Lord Balfour, who we talked about the Balfour Declaration, also himself was a Christian Zionist, right? And I think that in the way that, you know, the Balfour Declaration is really central to the way that we understand how the state of Israel came to be founded, right? And in many ways, how the current manifestation, right? This idea that this way that the state of Israel was founded and this formation of political Zionism has its root in the Balfour Declaration. So I was really curious, I'm, you know, wanting to explore with you all what the relationship was in the Jewish community to the Balfour Declaration. And we know that there was obviously a lot of support for it, an embrace of it by the Jewish community of these Christian Zionist ideas about Jewish settlement of this land in historic Palestine. One of the things that I've always thought is noteworthy is that in, you know, Herzl, for example, wasn't fixated on the Jewish state happening in historic Palestine, right? There was lots of ideas of where this Jewish state, right? He was invested in a Jewish state being formulated, and he was open to many parts of the world that could become the home of this Jewish state. And so I really think that it's this wedding of this idea of Christian Zionism with this idea within the Jewish community of a need for a Jewish state that produced the settler colonial project of Zionism in historic Palestine. So getting back to what the relationship was in the Jewish community, and I always like to, you know, obviously go and find my people in history. And there is this really wonderful rabbi who a group of us actually of JVP members have been gathering weekly to study his texts. I actually have his book here. You can see his face. Here he is. Rabbi Aaron Samuel Tamaris. So Rabbi Tamaris lived from 1869 to 1931. And he spent most of his life as a rabbi in a small town in Poland. He notably was an early member and enthusiast of the Zionist movement, and he was a delegate to the Fourth Zionist Congress, which was held in London in 1900. So he went there to the conference in 1900, assuming that he was going to leave embracing and being a leader within the Zionist movement, and it actually led to his resignation from the Zionist movement. He was so disturbed by what he saw there, then laid bare the actual aims and methods of Zionism. And this was actually before the First World War. But I want to read you from his words. So in this book, we have a translation of some of his papers. The book again is called A Passionate Pacifist, Essential Writings of Rabbi Aaron Samuel Tamaris. I just love that you could like see his face. Like it's not usual we have these like rabbis of history and you like have a face to go with it. So here he is. So he's writing I'm going to read you something that was written in 1930, just a short little excerpt. And this was written in 1930. So way before the founding of the state, and he never saw the foundation of the state of Israel, right? He died in 1931. But he's living in a post-World War I Europe, right? And the Balfour Declaration is in the background, so he'll reference it here. So here I'm going to quote from him. The Zionism of today, whose leaders love to gain audiences at courts, has made its imprint clearly. It is the expression of a self-negation before the nations of the earth, those masters of falsehood and fist, whose ideals have become lodged in the hearts of the ethical stragglers among our people during this bitter period. The eagerness for the Zionist cure is a sign both of inner doubt and of inner pain, which had not expressed themselves so openly before. The reaction to the Balfour Declaration revealed already a long-standing self-deprecation before the territorial nations and the desire to become like unto them, a humiliating state of spirit which had hesitated to bear itself previously. End quote. So there's a lot here, and maybe you didn't catch it all in a first reading, and I can share it afterwards in the name of the rabbi and the book, so you all can look into it. But what he says, is pretty harsh, right? He doesn't mince words, right? You could feel his anger and his pain, right? So he's noticing that at this time, right, it's post-World War, there was just tremendous loss of life, right, throughout Europe, and of tumult, right? And then he's kind of lambasting his own Jewish community for saying the Balfour Declaration comes and you embrace it and you're willing to give up your most ethical of sacred obligations, which to him is a refusal to harm others, right? He's a pacifist very deeply, and he understands that he sees this as like the most egregious spiritual sin, right? Almost. Sin is not a concept in Judaism, but you probably get my drift, right? And where he says, he kind of paints it as if there's this kind of embrace of the Jewish community of these ideas of Zionism that kind of reveal this inner doubt and inner pain. And that's kind of how I have to say I really resonate with that, and how I've experienced a clenching to Zionism that has supplanted and has been in contradiction to much of Jewish religious teaching and Jewish cultural life. But it also points to this broader problem in the history of Zionism, which is this unholy alliance between Christian and Jewish Zionists, right? So here's this rabbinical leader in Europe saying, like, this is not healthy for my people. This is not good for my people, right? And today, over a century later, we are the inheritors of that alliance, right? This, as Jews and as Christians, I'm speaking to primarily here. I know that's the majority of who we have on the call today. They're not entirely. Like, our work, if we are able, right, is to be the inheritors of that alliance. And as we're alive, kind of like use what compassion and clarity and connection that we have to insist in something else, in a different future for our people as Jewish and Christians, right? So I think a lot about this idea that part of my role in our work at JVP is to go get our Jewish families, our Jewish neighbors, our Jewish cousins, right? And like work with them on what Zionism is doing to Jews as a people, right? Like engage our Jewish people. And I think for the Christian community, it's just essential for that work to happen as well within your communities. And I think that the need for it, and I don't want to put too fine a point on it, is really urgent, because part of what's happening is that there's a profound conflation, I feel like probably everybody on this call knows, between Zionism and Judaism, right? And this conflation is kind of at the center of what's allowing, right, Israel in many cases to shield itself from accountability for their human rights violations, right? When you're labeled an anti-Semite for wanting to hold the Israeli government accountable, right, it is because of that conflation, right? So it's really essential that our work right now in this political moment is to really attend to and pull apart that conflation of Zionist equals Jew. And so this is really timely right now, speaking to what we can do about it, is that, as you might have seen, this past week, 31 organizations, actually, a very long list, have come out with a campaign called Facebook We Need to Talk, which you could go to facebookweneedtotalk.org to read all about, where we're very concerned because Facebook is considering codifying into their hate speech policies the idea that Zionist equals Jew. And the ramifications for that, as you can imagine, are manifold, right? And so I think part of what allows this idea, right, which the Israeli government itself is forwarding throughout the world, that Zionist equals Jew, and therefore, if you critique a Zionist, you're critiquing a Jew, and that is anti-Semitic. That's a very dangerous logic puzzle, right? And so the obscuring of Christian Zionism and modern day political Zionism, I think, makes it harder for us to confront Zionism and to deal with, to deconflate, to take apart Zionism and Judaism, because they're not the same thing and they never have been. So I believe that as long as the conflation of Zionism and Judaism continues, it will be harder for us to dismantle anti-Semitism and hold Israel accountable. And visibilizing how Zionism is not Judaism is essential to that. And I think that work is all of ours to take up together. So I don't want to go on too much longer because I want to leave room for question and answer, but I'd love to explore this a little bit further. And I feel like if I had more time, the next thing that I would want to get into, in case you want to ask questions about that or dig into it yourself, is how that conflation itself, that Zionist equals Jew, is itself anti-Semitic, right? Which is part, like, there's so many layers to this. But I just want to say that I think that this is really urgent. And I have been so encouraged that our friends at FOSNA, Friends of Sabeel North America, have taken up this fight at the past number of years, showing up as they could at the CUFI conferences in DC and visibilizing opposition to Christian Zionism. I think that we need to embrace that the Zionism, as it's manifested today, is not just a Jewish communal problem. It's a problem in the Christian community as well. And it's for progressive Christians to go and engage the evangelical Christian Zionist community, just as it's the Jewish community's obligation to work within the Jewish community. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. God, there's so much here to talk about. There's so much more, that so many directions we could take this conversation, but I do want to get to the questions and answers. And I also want to mention that we're gonna try to collect all of the questions that don't get answered, as well as all the resources, the book that Alyssa mentioned, and we'll compile them in a list of resources that will be emailed out to everybody. Jennifer has been collecting the questions, so rather than take time finding people and having them unmute, I'm just going to ask Jennifer if you could go ahead and pose the questions.
All right. Well, I wanted to start just chronologically. I mean, it's hard to sort through them all, but I'm going to say one question from Patricia is, how does funding from AIPAC and other Jewish Zionist sources measure against that from Christian Zionist organizations? And are there figures to compare? So that's one question about funding. And Patricia asked a second question. Is it your thought that if another land was found other than Palestine, the notion of a state for Jewish people only would not have been? The potential for supremacy and apartheid would not have been. That a diverse, democratic, and equal rights state would have been the goals. So those are kind of two questions, but I think I highlighted the first one, which was about funding. So I don't know if people want to speak to that.
Jennifer, if it's easy, can you just copy the questions and put them in the chat so we can all look at them?
It is easy, yes.
I'd like the presenters, John, Therese, Sadie, Alyssa, whoever wants to have a go at it, just unmute and have that.
I would say that for both AIPAC and CUFI, Christians United for Israel, it's really very difficult to track the sources and the expenses of their outflow. We do know that CUFI, I think, as Sadie said, involves tens of millions of dollars. The money they draw in is a huge amount. I don't know if they work, if they go to the same places. I don't think they pool their money. I think they're separate. But if you go to the CUFI website, you won't find any tracking of funds. So they keep it quite quiet.
And I would want to jump in there on that to say, like, I don't know about money, but I've been thinking lately about numbers, right? So CUFI claims 7 million members, right? Which is a huge number. 10 million now? Last I saw it was 7 million, which is basically the same size as the entire population of Jews in the United States, right? So when you think about influence on U.S. foreign policy, like Christian Zionist influence dramatically outperforms strictly Jewish, as you know, like AIPAC isn't actually a Jewish organization, right? Like it speaks in the name of Jews, but it's not traditionally one. So I think like that's another piece that I think what I'm kind of pushing us to think about as like, how do we highlight that and centerpiece that? Because I think as long as people, I think there is like something mildly fishy there, the way that like it's put up like Jews are influencing U.S. foreign policy, which is like plays into anti-Semitic tropes about Jews controlling the world, when in actuality, Christian Zionism, it really seems to me play, especially in the past 4 years, but I think even beyond that, has played an outsized role in shaping U.S. foreign policy.
Also, CUFI did apply for the Paycheck Protection Program for up to $1 million, which, to just give you an idea, that was to fund your payroll for 8 weeks. So apparently their payroll for 8 weeks at CUFI is $1 million. So that gives you a little bit of like insight into what kind of budgetary world they're living in. They have resources that run vast and deep.
If nobody else has a comment on that, Jennifer, you want to hit us with the next question?
Sure. Clyde Leland asks, and I'll post this in the chat as well. What are there examples of Israel-identified Jewish groups, i.e. AIPAC, and Christian Zionist groups, for instance, CUFI, working or meeting together?
Can you repeat the question again?
Are there examples of Israel-identified Jewish groups like AIPAC and Christian Zionist groups like CUFI working or meeting together?
Yeah, I put in the chat a link to CUFI's like conference speaker list from last time. The short answer is yes.
Mm-hmm. I also think of the groups on university campuses all over the country, the Hillel groups, who are very present and very active in my experience, and very much in conflict with Students for Justice in Palestine on the same campuses, trying to make aware of the Palestinian narrative. So that would be another group that I'm aware of.
Elliot has a question. I'm going to give him a little boost since he did the work. This whole event is largely his brainchild. Wondering if any of the presenters can speak to the relationship to Christian Zionism that seems to enliven many African American and Latino churches.
I think that speaks to the evangelical nature of Christian Zionism. So evangelicalism really is rooted in trying to convert as many people as possible. And they send missionaries, and again, they're well funded, right? So they have these missionary things where they pop up, where they plant these churches all over the country and all over the world. And many of the times they try to put them in these neighborhoods that are specifically targeted. And you can see them in San Francisco. They're like they look really flashy and they have really lovely websites. But if you start digging deeper about who's their like head church or who is over them, they lead back to some of these same evangelical forces and roots. And so it has to do with the way that their evangelical network works in planting churches in these neighborhoods where they have the funding and the resources to provide some of the basic needs that neighborhood needs. And I've heard it, some of my organizing work, we talked about the recruitment strategies of the KKK in the South, right? They have resources. And so they're providing basic needs for some of the folks in the neighborhood. Like they're providing food, they're providing whatever. It's a very strategic recruitment strategy that they're helping meet some of these basic needs. And in that way, these folks are becoming part of these organizations without fully being told or understand, because I don't think that they don't stand up there and say, we are Christian Zionists, and as Christian Zionists, this is what we do, and this is what we believe, and this is rooted in white supremacy, right? That's not going to be part of the sermon that they tell on a Sunday morning. So it's all part of these flashy pop-up churches, in my opinion, about how it gets spread into these other communities.
I'm not a presenter, but so I feel a little like I'm overstepping and this is not an area of expertise for me, but I don't know exactly, Elliot, about the African and Latino churches, but I was raised in a very Christian community, and I feel like even and this is, somebody asked a question about how do mainstream major U.S. churches react to Christian Zionism and its political aspersions. I do think that the U.S. European embrace of the idea of Israel from 1948 was largely grounded in anti-Semitism, right? England founded Israel after having fought for a long time about the best way to expel Jews. And I just think, while I think there are many geopolitical elements and it was a complicated moment in history, I just think that anti-Semitism is like a big part of kind of Western thought, whatever that means, right? Oh, I was doing little air quotes. And I think that this idea of having a place for people to be that isn't here makes the idea of Israel very interesting. And for that to look like it's in solidarity with oppressed Jewish people only adds to kind of the attraction of it as kind of an ideological thrust. So that's just my own whatever. Sorry. Okay. So Alyssa Wise added that there's a question from Patricia earlier that she thinks she misunderstood what I was saying when I pointed out that Herzl wasn't wedded to the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. My point wasn't that it would have happened somewhere else, it would be okay. It is that choosing that place that was part of Christian Zionist influence on Zionism has used Jewish religious tradition as a tool of settler colonialism. Of course, Zionism, more than ever, is a settler colonial project and would not be just or equal, I don't think, although I know some people disagree. So, I mean, that's a big question, I think, the question of could there be, right? And I think, and other people speak to that. Jim Haber says, Zionism has become anti-Semitic, hasn't it, offensive as that sounds? And then Howard Lindsay asks, what is the opposite of Zionism and where is the middle ground?
So I'd like to jump in here. Sorry, Alyssa. I'd love to hear what you guys think, but I have been wondering if perhaps a good follow-up webinar to this, if people are interested, would be liberation theology. Just want to put that out there. Go ahead, Alyssa.
Well, for me, I mean, I don't know about the opposite of Zionism, but from a Jewish communal perspective, I feel like the thing that I want is Jews to be safe and free wherever they live. Like diaspora to me is the opposite, like thriving Jewish communities wherever we are in the world, right? And I think part of what is so hard about what Zionism has done to Jewish religious and cultural life is made it that it's either us or them. And we know that that's not true, right? Like that somehow Jews having their own state is going to be the way that Jews are going to be safe in this world. And I just really, on like the most deepest level, don't agree with that. Don't think that that's a possibility, right? So to me, the concept of diaspora, the concept of thriving wherever we are, and the idea that like we all need to be free and equal and have that freedom is the only thing that will allow Jews or anyone to be safe.
Should I ask one more question? Do we have time for one more question?
Anybody else want to add to that? Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Jennifer.
Okay, so Janet asked a question. I'm just going to drop it in the chat too in a second. That said Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all monotheistic Abrahamic religions. Reverend Sadie Stone pointed out that Christian Zionists believe that God is on their side. Does that mean that God is not on the Muslim sides? Do all three of these religions believe in the same single God, or does each of these religions have its own separate God it believes in?
This is a fun question. So I believe that it's all the same God, that these Abrahamic traditions are woven together and it's the same God. This is a question, though, that if you asked different people from different religious or Christian traditions would have a different answer for you. They might agree that the Jewish God is the same God because we share scriptures with the Jewish tradition, but not Muslims. That they would say not Muslims for sure, depending on the Christian thing. So I can't speak for all Christians because you will get a different answer depending on the Christian that you're talking to. And I think for many Christian Zionists, you see that very clearly when we see the way that their theology is playing out, right? That there's this idea that they will work with Jewish people in creating this Jewish state, but ultimately their goal and their mission is conversion, that Jewish people have to convert and accept Jesus in some way in order for that to fulfill this destiny. And so I think ultimately for them, they would say that God is on their side and God is even on like America's side. It would go even further to be very specific in that way. And I don't know, John, if you want to add something to that from a Christian perspective.
Well, I'll make a sweeping generalization. I think more progressive churches encourage people to think through their faith themselves, their theology. More conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical Christians teach a faith that should be incorporated and cut and paste to each person. So I think what we find is that we have folks who, they don't question their leadership, and they simply paste on what they say, and that will be, well, folks are going to go to hell unless they convert to be Christians. And that's something that's very conservative, and I believe is falling by the wayside because people, especially younger people, are thinking more for themselves in the faith traditions.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I'm not a theologian, but my experience, I've lived in a Muslim culture, and I never had any doubt in my mind that it's the same God. In fact, in Arabic, Allah is the word for God. So when I say Allah as a Christian, and the Muslim says Allah, it's the same God that we pray to. We just, it's like a different face of God. It's just a different experience depending on the culture, the religious culture that we are brought up in, but it's the same God.
Thank you, Tamaris. I think it's really important to point out, maybe particularly to Americans, that Allah is just one of the other names for God. We're at time now, so I want to respect everybody's time, and really many thanks to the presenters. You guys were amazing. We appreciate your wisdom and your kindness, your warmth. It even comes through on Zoom. So as I said, I'll be following up with a list of resources, the book that Alyssa mentioned. As soon as she gets me the information, I'll put that on the list. And any of the presenters, if there's anything you spoke about that you want to put on that list, let me know, and I will make sure that that goes out to everybody who registered. Thank you all again. Thanks so much. And maybe we'll do a follow-up on liberation theology and diasporaism.
That would be great.
Thank you, everybody.